Let's go live to Trudy McIntosh now. She joins us from Canberra after another big announcement out of the US this morning. It was done virtually, of course, which we've come to get used to over the last 2 years or so. But Trudy, we can't oversell how big a moment this was in countering Chinese aggression.
Laura, this has been called a tectonic shift by defence analysts today. The decision by Australia now to acquire this fleet of nuclear-powered submarines. We've flirted with this in the past, but now the Morrison government locking this decision in. There's still a lot of question marks, things up in the air. How much will this crucially cost, and will they come in ahead of the timing of the other submarines we had already purchased? Now, that's the other critical dimension to this here, diplomatically at least. They're managing the relationship here with France. We know there's been that troubled $90 billion submarine deal with the shipbuilder in France, Naval Group. They've responded in the last hour in a statement. They've said, quote, "This is a major disappointment for Naval Group, which was offering Australia a regionally superior conventional submarine with exceptional performances." Former US Ambassador in Washington now, Joe Hockey, has told Sky News this morning that France can barely be surprised that this is the decision that's been come to by Australia.
Frankly, I applaud the Morrison government, genuinely applaud it, for making a decision to can the French proposal when we've only spent 1 to 2% of the total cost. You don't can these proposals, and all too often it's happened to defence, that they can the proposals. It hasn't worked when they've spent 50% of the money. In this case, we've made the hard decisions having spent only 1 or 2% of the total cost. Thank God.
The Prime Minister, the US President, the UK Prime Minister, all at pains to point out this morning that these are nuclear-powered submarines, that they don't contain nuclear weapons on board. There's also a domestic political reality for Scott Morrison here. He also went out of his way to emphasise that this does not open the door for a domestic onshore nuclear power industry. But there is some members within his coalition who think that might be the right approach going forward.
It would make sense for us to look at the nuclear power requirements for Australia alongside nuclear submarines. It would presumably only enhance our capabilities.
Nuclear power, nuclear power, I love the stuff. Well, I don't know, this is what I mean, we don't have these trained people down here, and this is our biggest problem that we've got.
We are going to hear from Scott Morrison later today, but Trudy, he wanted to really knock that on the head early on, didn't he, saying that this was not going to be the direction in which Australia would go in, and necessarily saying, you know, it's not nuclear power, doesn't open the door to that. There'll be many questions about that. Also questions about things like the Port of Darwin. I spoke to Peter Jennings a little earlier, and he had some interesting things to say about that.
Yeah, Laura, Peter Jennings is in the camp, really, of defence hawks in Australia who believe that Port of Darwin lease struck in 2015 with the Chinese-owned company Landbridge should be reviewed and torn up, essentially, by the government. It's worth remembering the Defence at the moment is reviewing this lease. The National Security Committee of Cabinet expected to get that advice imminently, and then it will be interesting to see if there is advice coming from Defence into the heart of government suggesting it should be torn up. Is that the next thing we see from the Morrison government? Take a listen to what Peter Jennings had to say about whether that should be the case.
I think over time there's another question here that government has to deal with about the past decisions to sell or lease important parts of Australian critical infrastructure to Chinese companies. That just doesn't work when we have a China which has fundamentally become hostile to Australia's strategic interests.
Now, a lot of people will be watching very closely what happens now, the reaction from Beijing to this deal that has been struck with Australia. If we think we've seen the campaign of coercion in the past with those list of grievances directed towards Australia, Laura, you can imagine a 15th one will be added today.